Putin held a press conference. I think it was approximately 2 in the morning. I'm amazed by the guy. It's just like if I were president and said, like, I've done too much. I'm sorry. Let me go to sleep tonight. And he had an incredibly busy schedule over the course of the Victory Day celebrations. He met with dozens of leaders. Sometimes, in the case of Xi Jinping, it was 7 hours. It was just talks and, one after another. But I think he saw the need to counter that 30-day ceasefire ultimatum, because that's really what it was. It was something that Ukraine did in coordination with the Europeans and apparently with the Americans, but then maybe not. We'll talk about that later. So if you remember, it was Starmer, Macron, Tusk of Poland, and also the new chancellor from Germany.
Merz.
Merz, yeah, I was going to say Gertz, but I knew that was wrong. Merz. They all took the train to Kiev and met with Zelensky, and they worked out the way they were going to present this ultimatum, because essentially, okay, 30 days immediately, no preconditions whatsoever, none of this talk about monitoring and working out some sort of, the details of the ceasefire. We're just going to declare a ceasefire, and Russia has to agree to it, or else we're going to we're going to supply more weapons than ever to Ukraine, and we're going to slap new sanctions on Russia. And so it was going to be, the idea was, I think that I doubt that they thought the Russians were actually going to cave in. But they thought that maybe they can make them look bad, make them look like they're the warmongers. We want peace, and the Russians clearly want war. Now, of course, the Russians have explained, they made it clear, many times, especially I think it was back on March 18th, that Putin said in a conversation with Trump, explained that, look, okay, yeah, I'm not opposed to a ceasefire in principle, but to have a ceasefire that works, we do have to figure out how it's monitored, how violations are dealt with, and so on. And what he was saying is true. Sort of that's common sense. That's been the experience in past conflicts. You do need to do that. You just declare a ceasefire, the chances are that 99 out of 100, the thing's going to break down. But then also he said that, okay, and during the ceasefire, you can't continue to supply arms to Ukraine. Because we know the reason that they're agreeing to the ceasefire now is that they're losing. And actually their situation is becoming increasingly desperate. And I would add that they probably are aware of an upcoming offensive by the Russians. And they would love to put a halt to that, So it's all to the advantage of the Ukrainians. And they say, okay, we get a rest. We prevent the Russians from launching their offensive. We get to rearm. And then we'll be in a stronger position than ever. But the Russians are not going to do this. They've seen this happen before. It happened prior to the Minsk agreements. It was actually, it wasn't really the Russians back then, though the Russians provided support. It was the Donbass militia had the Ukrainian army surrounded in eastern Ukraine. And it was looking really bad for the Ukrainians. Chancellor Merkel rushed over to Moscow and, begged for a ceasefire, and then which led to the Minsk Accords, as we know. And in both cases, it turned out the ceasefire and the subsequent Minsk Accords were just a way of buying time for the Kiev regime. And, they never actually implemented the Minsk Accords, as we know. They never had any attention, as Poroshenko, Hollande, and Merkel herself said. But they used that time to rearm the Kiev regime, the Ukrainian armed forces. So anyway, the Russians know what's happened. They got burned once. If it hadn't happened before, maybe Putin would agree to it. He showed a willingness to trust the other side in the past, but he has become much more cynical, and I think rightly so. So he said, no, we have these conditions. We're going to have a ceasefire. But, he had said earlier, we are willing to conduct negotiations, without any kind of preconditions. We get together and we can start negotiating. And so what he did with this conference is he countered that kind of PR move on the part of the West at 2 a.m. in the morning, immediately after the West had made, introduced their proposal with all this fanfare. He offered a counter proposal. And what it is that, look, yeah, let's just go negotiate. We were doing that before, back in back in March of 2022. And then, of course, well, Kiev walked away from it. We were in Istanbul. Let's go back to Istanbul and continue. And, again, we'll hash it all out. This is what we did have an agreement, a draft agreement back then. We can produce a new one. So let's get, and so this, I think, was, this has always been the Russian position, but it was also really a very effective kind of counter move in the propaganda war. So instead of looking like, okay, the Russians just want war, they're not interested in peace. They're not offering a path to peace. Well, he is offering a path to peace. And and I think he did so very effectively.
How is Ukraine going to respond to that?
Well, they've already rejected it. But then Zelensky said that he'll go to Istanbul and, to meet Putin. He'll be waiting for him there. And so, you see that headline and you think, oh, does that mean that he actually agreed to Putin's offer? No. Actually, if you read the words carefully, I think there's some deliberate ambiguity, but he is still rejecting any negotiations because, again, he's sticking with the Western proposal that it will have a ceasefire and then negotiations. So what he's saying is that I'm assuming that you're going to have a ceasefire and then I can meet you in Istanbul. But that's not what the Russians have offered. And then, as others have pointed out, look, Putin's not going to Istanbul. Like when the Istanbul agreement was reached, it wasn't Putin there in Istanbul. It was his negotiation team. So I don't know why Zelensky would go there anyway. So yeah, they've already rejected it.
Okay, so this move by the Western powers with this 30-day ceasefire proposal, you think was just basically Putin's response to it by saying, let's go back to the Istanbul talks, no preconditions, negotiate, completely kind of annulled that attempt, that PR attempt for the Ukrainian side to get a ceasefire, try to get a ceasefire. And if they don't, continue to give more ammunition, propaganda to vilify the Russian war machine and say, like, look, they don't want any peace. So you think that that's basically what happened?
Yeah, and it seems to have been effective. I mean, of course, the West is always going to, and its media propaganda machine is always going to try to, to give the most negative spin possible to anything that Putin does. But I imagine that even so, he's managed to muddy the waters somewhat. This clear propaganda victory has been tarnished, on the Western side. And for most of the rest of the world is looking at it and say, hey, yeah, the Russians have a plan. And I think it was very, very successful then. And then interestingly, apparently succeeded with Trump himself. Because Trump had signed up and said, okay, Russians, yeah, you got to agree to a ceasefire. He seemed to be on board with the whole thing. And he assumed that, they coordinated. I think there was a call between Trump and the assembled leaders in Kiev. And so it looked like, okay, at least the Western leaders thought that they were all on the same page and they were going to go ahead with this. But the minute that, or not the minute, but shortly after but Putin, presented his counter proposal, Trump said, hey, Kiev, yeah, now we got a plan, go to Istanbul. And so
Trump and his ever-changing mind, it's
like they always said, a lot of people said it's like the last person to talk to him is, if you want to know what he's thinking, just find out who he talked to 20 minutes ago. And so like he heard Putin and say, hey, that makes sense. So yeah, you'd have to say Putin's press conference was very successful.
Do you think that we're seeing something a little bit different coming out of Russia now in terms of when the SMO was first launched, you said that Russia did just a terrible job explaining itself. Nobody understood really what the goal was. They wanted with a smaller force, but then we later found out that it was to try to force some type of negotiated settlement, which was the Istanbul talks. Right. But now what we're seeing potentially now is that maybe Russia is beginning to engage in the PR war a little bit more. And perhaps it's because the Western propaganda machine just went full steam, that it actually damaged itself because Russia didn't engage in the PR war that much. They weren't trying to pump it out. Instead, you had the Western side just go nuts with it and call anybody that tried to explain the Russian position that as Russian propagandists. People in the West, where people are just trying to figure out, because it didn't look like Russia was trying to put its story out, because it would immediately be, like, here's Russian propaganda coming out of Russia. But now that maybe the Western propaganda machine has been exposed to such a large extent, Russia has built up its reputation of being a cool, rational actor and not engaging in this propaganda war, that it actually is able to now, to some extent, it's able to start to, like, okay, we're going to be very careful and put out our positions more forcefully now.
Yeah, no, I was thinking the same thing. It's like, oh, yeah, maybe these guys are getting better at this, and they do it in their own way. It's Putin, so it's not, it's not just rhetoric. It's not just a bunch of cliches. It is substantive. It is real, but he understood the need to get that out there forcefully, clearly, and quickly, and he did it. And I didn't see that in the past. So yeah, I think they've learned the importance of the information war, and they're going to fight it. They'll fight it in their own way. But it looks like, I think it probably took the Western leaders by surprise. They're used to being able to completely control the narrative, and this time the narrative got kind of lost control of it pretty quickly, especially with Trump's comments.
With the Western media just always covering for Ukraine and vilifying Russia, how do they counter the narrative? Is it just mostly through social media? I mean, how do we know that this was a really successful counter by Putin?
Well, I mean, this has been reported in more than one place, and I think there is some, even I haven't read the Western reports, but I've just seen some headlines. But it sounds like even Western media kind of recognize that Putin was very effective in this, and have grudgingly shown him some respect. But in general, yeah, of course, if you're in the West, the best sources are social media, because that's just not controlled in the way that the mainstream media is.
So you don't think we're going to see the Ukrainians go to Istanbul and take up Putin's offer to try to end this?
No, it seems clear to me that that they have rejected his offer, which is to say, hey, no ceasefire now. Let's talk, and maybe that can lead to a ceasefire. If we make progress, then we can have a ceasefire. They rejected that, so I don't see them going. If they go, it's just it's pure PR, not based on anything, based on a lie, essentially. If they try to do that.
So we're going to just probably see Russia continue to move forward, probably engage in some type of a major offensive, you think, in the next month or so?
There's just a lot of talk. We know that they have, hundreds of thousands of well-equipped soldiers in reserve, that have not been, that are back there. And it's hard to believe that they're not going to be enter the fight at some point pretty soon.
Do you think all the Western leaders in Europe are they all on cocaine?
I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me. That's all I would say. Of course, you're talking about that incident. There was some sort of mysterious white object on the table, and
that Macron took away. I mean, I'm sure many people saw it. It was very suspicious, and Mertz covered up a little cocaine. I don't know what else you'd be using a little spoon like that for. So I don't know. To me, it wouldn't surprise me at all, and it actually helps explain a lot. We keep on asking, like, what are these Europeans thinking? Like, there's no rationality. It's like, oh, okay, they're all on cocaine. Then now it makes sense. Because they're a bunch of chihuahuas, but if you're on coke, they think they're lions, and they think they can, and they get together and they're all doing coke together, and they're like, yeah, we can do this and this and this. It's like, that's just the cocaine talking, guys. This isn't the anything sane, nothing rational. I honestly, I think that could be true. And if that is true, that's scary. That's scary. You don't want a bunch of cokeheads trying to deal with the world's largest nuclear power and, saying we're going to take them down.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
a no-no.
yeah, right. Well, if they're, I don't know. Yeah, you may well be right. But even if they're not cokeheads, they clearly are unhinged and just, yeah, completely divorced from reality. So it is scary as it is. Whatever the cause of their unhinging, um, yeah, we ought to be very, very scared with these people in power.
If it's, do you think this incident? I mean, it's further going to damage their image. Macron, Merz, Starmer. Do you think that we could see these guys get out of office? I mean, I feel like Macron's been there for a long
Yeah,
time. Merz just came in. Starmer's pretty
yeah,
new. Like,
yeah. Well, they're very, very unpopular. I mean, I've heard that I don't know what the average approval rating for them is, probably in the teens or something. I mean, that very well may be true. I don't know what the exact number is, but it's the um, just recently, for example, Starmer's party suffered a historic loss in local elections, and not only was his party roundly defeated, but his own party has begun to rebel against him. They had been loyal, through thick and thin, but they saw him, suffer this major defeat. He had no explanation, no plans to do better in the next election, and he goes off to Ukraine. And so there's now direct criticism of him, for his Ukraine support. He does seem to be more interested in Ukraine than he is in this country, in the UK. And similar, we see similar things happening in both France and in Germany. These are very unpopular leaders. And all of them, they got office through, let's say, dubious means. They attained their office or retained their office through dubious means.
hopefully, we have a cleaning house. I feel like there's just a great awakening happening across all of the Western world. People are starting to realize something's fishy. In Europe, it's more like they're Ukraine firsters. In the United States, it's more Israel firsters. Is the issue.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, we have a ways to go, but clearly let's say the narrative is fraying at the edges. It's
yeah,
still dominant, but it's
I
fraying at
got.
the edges.
I know I need to temper expectations because Trump does this to me every couple of
Yeah,
months. Gives me hope, and then I'm like, "What?" And then he completely backtracks on it.
yeah,
So
right,
I don't know, but
right.
I guess I'm just so desperate for hope that I'm
Right.
just latching onto it.
Yeah.
It's just I
Okay.
really
Well,
have,
what else can you do sometimes? But um,
yeah.
yeah. Well, but we may. I again. Um, Trump's flip flopping is infuriating. It's a lot of things, but there is an encouraging side. It is the opposite of the usual doubling down. And then it is good that he flip flops on some of his more stupid ideas, like the tariff war or the bombing of the Houthis. And so maybe we should applaud that, and maybe again we'll see it with Iran. It's unclear what's going on right now. But the Israelis fear, and Netanyahu seems to fear, that he actually does want to make a deal. And I think he can, and all these, okay, it's definitely in the case of okay, the Houthis, Iran, the tariffs, these are deals that can be made. Yeah, you could say that in each case, it was the reason they can be made is that Trump himself kind of created the problem, right? He decided to start bombing the Houthis, and well, that didn't work, so he stops bombing. That's something you can do, right? He has control over that. Or in the case of Iran and the JCPOA, well, he tore up the first one. Well, okay, it was done. We can have a second one that, will be slightly different, and then he can proclaim victory. But yeah, he created the problem there, and he can walk it back. So, again, that's what we're seeing. The one agreement that I don't think he can reach is, again, in Russia. It's because that's not something that he really created. It's not just like he's cleaning up his own mess. That's something much bigger. And the two sides are really so far apart that I don't think any agreement at this point is possible. But the other ones I think we have reason to be hopeful on the tariff front, and with regard to Iran. We also have reason to be, especially in the case of Iran, to be nervous. And the reason is that, okay, he still has all these Iran hawks around him. There is this very powerful faction within his government that's always been there, that preceded his administration, that is for war with Iran. They're there. They're always looking for a way to subvert an agreement and to push push the U.S. into war with Iran. Now, in the case of the tariffs, I don't think that faction exists. You may find a couple of individuals, but there just isn't a faction that is for an all-out tariff war with China. So I think he can make an agreement, without really any resistance within his own administration or, anywhere else in the country. So I think we should be fairly confident. And again, with Trump, you can't be completely confident. Who knows? But I think that he's recognized that didn't work. And instead of doubling down, he's chosen to just give up on it and proclaim victory.